Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kyle Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Chief with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. We are the folks who investigate complaints of civil rights discrimination. We combat human trafficking all around the region. We ensure equitable language access to all people to county government services in the language of their preference. And we educate on issues of social justice and civil rights importance. With me today is co-host Tiana Davis, who's the outreach specialist with the Office of Human Rights, and Dr. Audrey Lau, the adult and senior programming specialist with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, who are our event partners for this evening. We are delighted tonight to welcome the two creators of the brand new graphic novel, Revolution by Fire, which I'll show you because it's super beautiful. It's based on the little-known real-life slave insurrection of 1741. The book imagines outlaw fugitive John Gwin and an eclectic crew of renegades as they attempt to disrupt and overthrow the colonial social order. There was more, but we're going to get Marcus and David to tell us more about that. So I'm going to take a minute and to introduce you to them now, and then we'll get right into the book. Author Marcus Rediker is a distinguished professor of Atlantic history at the University of Pittsburgh. He is the author of several books, including the Amistad Rebellion, which came out in 2012, and the Many-Headed Hydra, which is right here. It's Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic, and that came out in 2000. He worked with David Lester and Paul Boole to adapt his book, The Fearless Benjamin Lay, into Profit Against Slavery, Benjamin Lay, a graphic novel, which came out in 2021, and Villains of All Nations, Under the Banner of King Death, Pirates of the Atlantic, a graphic novel, which came out in 2023. And my understanding is that this book follows from the book I just mentioned. David Lester illustrated the award-winning 1919, A Graphic History of the Winnipeg General Strike. He also illustrated Profit Against Slavery, Benjamin Lay, a graphic novel, and Villains of All Nations, Under the Banner of King Death, Pirate of the Atlantic. And he is also a guitarist with the rock duo Mechanormal. So we're going to be talking about that as well today. But for now, I just want to thank you both for taking the time to be with us and welcome you to joining us tonight.
It's a great pleasure.
Glad to be here, yes.
We are hoping that you can start us off tonight by just telling us a bit, tell us about the story and what is this about?
Well, it's about, as you said, Kyla, a little known event in American history, but we think it's an event that needs to be better known. Peter Linebaugh and I wrote about the uprising in New York in 1741 in the book that you showed called The Many-Headed Hydra. And basically what happened was that in 1741, in the city of New York, in a waterside pub tavern near the Hudson River, a group of people began to conspire to overthrow the government of New York. The leaders of this were a man named John Gwin, who was also known as Caesar to his enslaver. He was an African-American man. He was enslaved. And the other figure that we emphasize in the book is his sweetheart, Margaret Carey. Margaret was Irish. She was known also by several names. One was Negro Peg. She got that name because her lover was black. But she was also known as the Newfoundland Irish Beauty. She worked as a sex worker in this tavern, and John Gwin would climb up on the top of a shed and enter her room every evening. On one of these occasions, he gave her a locket, which was a very precious thing to her. So they are meeting on a regular basis with primarily three groups of people, all of whom work on the waterfront. Okay, this is a waterfront conspiracy. The waterfront in the 18th century was a rough place, not for the faint of heart. It was a tough place, fighting, knife fights, but these waterfront workers knew that world and they lived in it. The three groups were, first of all, enslaved African Americans, of whom John Gwin was one. A second group was primarily Irish soldiers who were stationed at Fort George nearby. They were very mutinous and disobedient. And then there was a third group of mixed race Cuban sailors who had been captured by the English authorities and enslaved. They insist that they were free people of color, but they had been enslaved. So all three of these groups had very serious grievances. So they met in John Hewson's tavern. John Hewson was the tavern owner. He was a white man. There were several other whites involved besides the Irish. And slowly over time, they began to hatch this plot that they were going to commit a series of coordinated attacks of arson to create chaos in the city. And they would then attack the city, attack the military compound, seize the territory, and turn it over to the Spanish Empire. Spain at this time was offering freedom to all enslaved people who escaped the British Empire. So Spain was seen as a liberator at this moment. So this became a very serious conspiracy. It was not successful primarily because one of the rebels grew impatient and started setting the fires too soon. So the whole thing kind of fell apart. They did start the fires. I think it was 11 or 12 fires altogether. But they weren't properly coordinated. They couldn't get support from the countryside, which they expected, and they were eventually defeated by the local military, by the British Army and the local militia. A lot of people were arrested. There was a big show trial. This was a terrible thing from the point of view of the ruling class of New York, the rich and wealthy, or as they called them, as the rebels called them, they called them the men in ruffles. I think that's a great description of an 18th century gentleman.
I loved that when I was reading it. I thought that was fantastic.
Men in ruffles, that's a certain kind of class description. And they hated them. And of course, the men in ruffles hated these rebels every bit as much. So the way this ended up was that a very large number of people were hanged. Some of them were hanged in chains, which is an extra kind of punishment where your body is left exposed to the elements to sort of disintegrate. Your eyeballs might be plucked out by crows. And quite a number of people, because of the crime of arson, were then burned at the stake. So this was a defeat, but David and I turned this into a more hopeful story because, first of all, it is a powerful tale of interracial cooperation. Now, this is happening before racial categories harden in the 1790s. So in the Many-Headed Hydra, there are many different places where this kind of cooperation can take place and did take place. And we think that in itself is kind of inspiring. But the way, I'll let David talk about this at greater length, the way we have constructed the story is to make this event part of an Atlantic-wide circuit of communication among working people. And this was actually quite true and important, and that these stories of resistance are passed on. It turns out the 1730s, there were all kinds of revolts going on in the Caribbean, in North America, slave revolts everywhere. And so 1741 actually included in it, among the conspirators, people who had subversive experience in other places. So this, I think, is a very important thing. So David and I thought this was a good example to show people how a conspiracy actually worked, how a revolution was taking place, what they talked about, what they felt they needed to do, what was the plan, because we have really very detailed records about this. And as I say, we did want to make this a book in which you could recognize the rebels as real human beings, as people who, I mean, we wonder what would we do in those circumstances, right? So we wanted to make the book kind of immediate and straightforward. And I'll turn it over to David to talk a little more about how the book actually happened, because as the artist, he's the most important part of this team. And also to say a little bit about why we thought this book was a good thing to do right now.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to focus on the process of creating the book. And of course, it follows the trajectory of the two previous books that we've done, which is really, how individuals and groups of people combine together to resist terrible things that go on in their society and try to change those things. And so this is the thread that goes through the three books that we've completed. And so I think that typifies, I think, all of Marcus's work too. So it isn't just history for history's sake. There is a purpose to do these books.
Mhm.
And one of them is to, in a certain sense, to be activist books and to encourage and inspire activists as to how history has proven to be a difficult place to navigate, but there are successes and failures, and on the failures there can be built successes. And so this is part of the great fun that I have in being part of this project that we're doing, that has now entered a fourth book that we're working on. So, but for this talk, I wanted to just give a bit of an overview of how this book was created, and it's really for each of the books that we've created, but it's for those who want to know, how is a graphic novel, how does it come to be? And so I just will, first of all, and feel free to interrupt me at any moment, but I'll just spend a number of minutes here. In Revolution by Fire, we use the unique qualities of the graphic novel form to take a somewhat cinematic deep dive into what it takes to fight against tyranny and for a better world. The book explores what has been true of most rebellions, that they revolve around collective action, and graphic novels are well suited to present that dynamic visually. An original feature of the book is that it takes takes some visual elements of 20th century film and 19th century art in order to tell an 18th century tale of an uprising. And so all rendered, in my view, in glorious black and white. Yeah. And I'll touch on that later. But so first of all, I just wanted to talk about, exactly, there you go. There's the glorious black and white.
I know it's small, but I wanted people to get an idea of what we were talking about.
That's great. So as with the script, Marcus came up with an outline of the story, and he had created a selection of the main characters with bios and backstories for each of them. So that was the starting point. And as with our two previous graphic novels, I wrote the initial script, and it's very much like writing a film script. So it's broken down into numbered scenes with the characters' dialogue all written out carefully. And in each scene, some instructions visually of how that scene might be depicted. So that's the first draft, and of course with all of these books, there's so many fascinating things about it that you write way too long, and so then it becomes part of the process is to edit it down to a manageable size to draw, and so we go back and forth between Marcus and I. I send him the script, he goes over it, sends me edits, he goes back to me, and that process goes on for several months until we're satisfied that the drawing can begin. And so with Revolution by Fire, there was a real complexity to telling the story of a conspiracy, or for that matter, any kind of collective action. There's a lot of characters, there's a lot of relationships, and this book was substantially larger than the two previous books we did, because with Prophet Against Slavery, Benjamin Lay, there was one central character, Benjamin Lay. And with the book on pirates, most of the action took place on board a ship. So, but with Revolution by Fire, the action takes place all over New York City and involves many characters, many different communities, and many histories. And involves a revolt where buildings are set on fire. There's hand-to-hand combat, and there are mass arrests, mass trials, mass executions. And so how does one construct such a complex historical labyrinth into a graphic novel? And my suggestion was that we would have a narrator that would help propel the narrative along and hold the threads of the story and characters together. And as Revolution by Fire is based on a single chapter from Marcus and Peter Linebaug's book, The Many-Headed Hydra, I needed more detail to create the script. And so I read an almost 500-page transcript of the trial that was published at the time in the 18th century, and which incidentally Beacon Press published again in 1971, which highlights the profound importance of books and publishers over the course of centuries. And so from that trial transcript, I was able to construct a lot of, dialogue and also details about the various characters in the book, and that really added to the overall quality of it. And now just a little bit on the art. So for myself to draw progressive history from below, I feel requires a style that is rough as the history I'm depicting. And for me, the imperfections and the messy nature of social change and of revolution benefit from being conveyed through a drawing that is raw and bold. I want the reader of this book to feel the ink spilled on the pages. I want them to hold this book and be transported back hundreds of years, and to when they look at the art and read the words, to feel a visceral sense of holding history in their hands and being engaged with it. And that's again why I go back to using just black and white rather than color, which I feel color is not always true in a book. It's a bit fanciful, whereas I feel like black and white is more. It conveys more of a sense of history, and so that's why I do that. But it also goes back to my own aesthetic approach in my origins in music as a punk rock guitarist, in that the sound of a distorted chord ringing out into a room, I find it thrilling, and to me it's got a kind of raw beauty that has always appealed to me, and I find that in the roughness of the drawings too. So for each of the three books, visually they've been a progression and a challenge in how to communicate history from below in a graphic novel to a graphic novel readership. So I just had a couple more things I wanted to make. Two more points, and one is that as graphic novels are sequential art, I also took inspiration from film, with a conspiracy and uprising at the core of Revolution by Fire. I viewed films that had similar concerns, such as Matewan by John Sayles from 1987, which concerns the West Virginia coal wars, and consulted The Wind That Shakes the Barley, which is a Ken Loach film from 2006 about the Irish War of Independence. And finally, a 1972 film by Casagravas called State of Siege, which covers a kidnapping by the Tupamaros guerrilla group and in Uruguay. And so what I discovered is that aside from they're all great films, is that uprisings are plotted in secret meetings by small groups of people talking in rooms, taverns, homes, and on the street. And so how does one possibly make a meeting graphically interesting? Meetings are traditionally kind of boring, and so this, but we have to use the dialogue, and we have to create the use atmospherics of the art to engage, and because it's essential, because mostly I was struck by the fact that it didn't matter what century or decade or an uprising takes place, it generally still involved a meeting. And I realized how important it was to the story to spend the time and pages illustrating these meetings that form the backbone of the uprising. So I think we'll conclude here by just one thing I like to do, because I'm not sure how much people know about the creation of graphic novels. I like to show the tools that are used in making a graphic novel.
Oh, great.
So, first of all, also, because many people may think graphic novels are all done on a computer. and many of them are today. But I actually draw everything by hand in these books, except for the word balloons and the text in the balloons. So that process begins with, of course, paper. So here I use I don't know where I use a sketch pad this size to draw, and in order to operate that piece of paper, I do need a pencil, and in order to operate that pencil, I do need a pencil sharpener.
Right, that's a critical tool.
Once I have my pencil sketch, I need a pen in order to ink that pencil sketch. And then I need an eraser to erase those unwanted pencil lines. Finally, I need a tube of paint, which is, in this case, is watercolor, and I need a paintbrush in order to paint on those drawings. And that is, in essence, what you have in terms of making a graphic novel. Now, I use other techniques, like I splatter paint using a toothbrush and a knife, and in order to get some of the effects in this book, particularly splattering in terms of some of the action and stuff like that, and other methods of texture which involve different implements. There you go. There's an example of using a toothbrush splattering onto the page. So that is how I make a graphic novel, and how I create a graphic novel that's related to history from below. So there you go.
That is awesome. That is awesome. We have many questions. I see Tiana has unmuted, which is our secret code that she's got a great question. So I'm going to mute myself and hand it over to Tiana, and I'll come back because I got one too.
Yeah, so I don't really have a question. I just wanted to make a comment. I love that you spoke about what your intents were with the art, because just before you and Marcus joined the stream, I was talking to Audrey, and I was like, I love the art style because it feels very intentional. It feels like it was sketched with a pen, and it feels very chaotic, and I feel like that added to my my experience while reading. And then when you mentioned that you also took inspiration from cinema, that I didn't get it at like while reading, but after you said that, it made sense, because there are a lot of like places where, you know, there's if this were a movie, that would be where it would cut to commercial, right? Like there are cut pieces here, and it'll go to like a different story and then come back. So that was all I wanted to share.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wanted to talk a couple of things. Marcus, you mentioned interracial cooperation, and this is one of the things I loved about this story. Was a lot we can talk about here. One of the things you mentioned is that how racial categories kind of hardened in the 1790s. And so, although I know it's a little bit outside of the scope of this book, could you take just a minute to tell us like what happened? Like what was the change? What happened in the 1790s that changed these categories in the U.S.?
Well, they didn't just change in the U.S. They changed in many parts of the world. The 1790s was a very radical decade. There were all kinds of major resistance movements, and the greatest of them of all was the Haitian Revolution, in which Count Louverture and his army of former enslaved people defeated the French, who occupied the colony. They defeated the Spanish, and they defeated the British to establish the first Black republic in the world, the second country to establish its national independence in the Western Hemisphere, the first being the United States. The Haitian Revolution scared American enslavers to death. So all of the reaction against any sort of Black resistance was made very, very fierce. You can feel these racial categories hardening. But it was also a time when there was a great deal of uprising in Ireland. And as it happened, a lot of the racialization happened to the Irish too. The Irish were not considered to be white at this time. So that's one reason why this kind of alliance took place. But the 1790s is a period in America of retreat from the revolutionary principles of 1776, which talked about all men being created equal and that sort of thing. Well, believe me, that idea was, well, it was written, first of all, by an enslaver, Thomas Jefferson.
Right. Right.
We got to remember that. But there were a lot of people who did believe in that idea. Those people will come under attack in the 1790s, and the growth of racism and institutionalized racism and white supremacy really accelerated thereafter as the slave system itself grew stronger.
Right. Right. Thank you. I apologize to everybody for that little diversion, but I thought it was a really interesting point, and I wanted to make sure that we could sort of contextualize where we were and what happened. I had asked one more question, then I'll hand it over to Audrey and Tiana, hand it back. David, one of the things that you talked about as you're developing the script was that Marcus would send you a script and you'd kind of work on it and you go back and forth. And you're the illustrator, so I'm imagining as you're doing this, you have these scenes, this vision, you're kind of seeing it come together in your mind. As you handing the script back and forth, were there times where maybe a scene that you had really envisioned or that you felt was visually really important, that the narration was removed? And how do you kind of, if that happened, how do you sort of make sure that you're still, all these images that you've had in this way of telling the story is intact as the script shifts?
Do you mean like sequences that are purely visual?
Yes.
Is that kind of what you mean? Yeah. I mean, I feel I'm always thinking of the pacing of the book and of the reader. And I always feel like there should be quiet moments where there isn't text, where you can just simply look at the artwork, you slow down and rather than race through, because I find sometimes with certain graphic novels, you just kind of read the word balloons and you keep going and there's never a break. And so I'm really conscious of trying to really do some purely visual sequences in the book. And I tried to do as much as I could with that, but there was so much information as well. But that is something that I'm really concerned with. I want these, I want this to be an experience to the reader that is profound. And because it's so important, the history that we're telling here. Mm-hmm. And so that's so I do different techniques. One of them was to take an image. I've done this in the past, is to take a drawing and cut it up into pieces so it spreads out. So mm-hmm. the reader is forced to look at each drawing individually, and that slows them down to kind of to take in the artwork. And so that's one of the techniques. And yes, wherever I could sort of, get rid of text and just have visuals, I would go for that. And so there's certain amount of the book when the fires are set and the street fighting begins and those sorts of things, right? I don't think we needed to explain that. We needed to just show it, and it needed to take place over several pages in order to again, feel it a bit more than just simply, this is not a book about illustrating the text. This is a book where the text and the imagery is vitally important on mm-hmm. both sides. And that's the goal that I think we're trying to work with. And I think Marcus is a very, visually minded person. And I could tell that from reading his books. That he gets it in that sense, right? And so I feel like we're on the same page in terms of, how do you make an engaging book? And part of it isn't just about the facts or the information that you get across. It is about how it flows out and how the reader might respond to it. And so that's a fundamental part of this. And also, I've talked to and I always like to mention this, it's like to people who teach history, they've told me that students are increasingly unable to read longer texts like a prose book that is hundreds of pages, but they will be really thrilled to read a graphic novel that may be covering the same material. And mm-hmm. It's an introduction, it's an engagement that I feel is fundamental to our democracy, to our citizenry, because it's a far healthier society that we can have here if people are engaged in understanding history as mm-hmm. they go forward and how they make choices. And so this again, your question is very good, because I'm totally thinking about that, and I wish I had more pages, but it's there is a limit to what how many pages one can do in a book and how much time one has to draw it. And so yes, I hope that kind of touches on it.
It was a great answer, and it helps me understand, because for me as a reader, I tend to read graphic novels, and I'm just going to apologize in advance to some people who are going to get very upset. At high speed, reading the balloons, right? I just go on it. I'm not very visual, and I found that with this one, it was completely the opposite. Like, I was really looking at everything, and I got so much out of it. So it helps me realize what I've missed before.
Mhm.
But also, I think the way this is constructed, the story is not, it's in the text or in the drawings. It really is them together, and it's so rich. It's just an amazing book. I'm going to hand it over, but thank you. I've just loved it.
Great.
One of the things that I loved about this book as a historian, as someone who's taught history, is not just that here someone handed me a graphic novel that came from a book that I read for my comprehensive exams, which was fast. I was like, I've read this before. I think it sounds really familiar. Check my list. It was on there. I read it. But what I love is that I think we're learning now, 1619 Project, you know, we're really seeing historiography kind of coming into the mainstream that, you know, I think is a little behind. I mean, this book is from the original book is from 2000. It's been there for quite a bit, at least for historians. But like the Atlantic world in particular is such a fascinating period, and I love that this book really like captures the energy of that period, because, you know, as my professors always said, in order to have a revolution, you first have to be able to imagine it. And for you to be able to imagine it, you have to have a place where you can see the possibility. And that tavern is that imagination. Like, that is people coming together and like, this is possible. We can work together. Like, we have common interests. And this, like you said, scares the bejesus out of the men in ruffles. And so I love the fact that you're telling this story and the energy is there, because students miss out on that. But you all captured in a 100 and some odd pages this moment, and were able to make it so I mean, I get excited when I read books from this period because there's so much possibility in the air. I mean, we forget that our founding fathers met in taverns. They didn't meet in coffee shops. And what they were doing was treason, and they could have themselves been hung if they were, you know, again, a revolution is only, if it's successful, then it becomes something more. If it's not, it's treason, right? That's kind of how that works. I'd like you to talk a little bit about your inspiration for this. As you talk about, everyone's familiar, the world turned upside down from Hamilton, but that's not where it came from. And E.P. Thompson, some of those sources. Could you just talk about some of the inspiration as to why, when you chose to write a book, you picked this period?
That's a complex question, but Audrey, let me first compliment you on the observation that what the characters of this book were doing in John Huston's tavern was creating the kind of social order that they wanted to see in the world. In other words, Gandhi said, be the example of what you want to see. Benjamin Lay said, let your life speak. So these are very radical ideas that you can act out the future in the present. And to me, that's very hopeful. So I just wanted to comment on that. How I came to do this kind of work, there are many ways to answer this. One, I had an inspirational teacher at Virginia Commonwealth University. I was working in a factory and going to school at night. He was an early Americanist. He opened my eyes not only to that field, but to becoming a historian. And then the second thing that happened was that I became an Atlantic historian kind of by accident, because when I got to graduate school, I knew I wanted to do history from below, the sort of movement-inspired history of working people. But I thought I was going to study slavery, Caribbean slavery in particular. But I decided to write my first research paper on sailors and pirates. So I became an Atlantic historian simply by following sailors everywhere they went in their working lives, and they went all around the Atlantic. So they helped me to discover that really as a field. And then I met Peter Linebaugh not long after I began graduate school, and he was a professor at that point, a junior professor, and we hit it off immediately and decided we wanted to write a book together. Now, it took a lot of years to do it, but that became the Many-Headed Hydra, and Peter is a brilliant historian of the 18th century, and it was a great thrill to work with him in writing that book. So some of it's by design, some of it's by chance. But then there's also the point that you make, which is that it is such a fascinating period with the rise of capitalism. There's also the great revolutionary movements in Haiti, in the United States, in Britain, in France. It's just an extraordinary period.
Okay, I'm going to real quick, Kyla, jump really close. I just have a real quick question for David. You mentioned the transcripts, and one of the ways I get my students interested in history is by giving them things. So like you have a map in here, you said you talked about the transcript. Was there anything else that you looked at when you were creating these pages? Like, did you look at pictures, or did you kind of make these people up in your head? Like, what did you use like as your source material?
Well, this is the thing about the 18th century. There are no photographs, there are no videos, there is no audio. So you have to research as much as you can how people looked and what kind of hats, what kind of pipes they smoked, what kind of shoes they had, what kind of breeches they had, and and from the working class to the ruling class. So you have to, as an artist, do all of that research, and also what kind of utensils they had. It's kind of endless, and it is very much like making a film where you have to dress the set, and you want to be as accurate as you can, and of course you have to make up some things. But you consult paintings, you consult sketches from the time period. But we know a lot of the paintings and etc. that come from these time periods, they're of the ruling class, and it's from that perspective. So you have to dig deeper to find other possibilities and representations. And so it is a bit of a detective job to be as accurate as you can. And also one of the things was, like, I spent a long time figuring out, how did people start a fire? Because they didn't exactly have matches. So the whole thing of a piece of flint, and what did they use? And I can't tell you how much time I spent on that little issue. And there were other things too. And also, in the book, there's a lot of flames. I had to learn how to draw flames. And when you think of flames, you just think it's it's like that. But you really have to look at flames to understand of how weird they are, and how do you convey that in a drawing, because flames are in movement. And so I spent a long time looking at flames everywhere, and every kind of possibility in every century to come to terms with that. One other thing I wanted to do another demonstration was, how does one draw a character over the course of 167 pages? And so I've come up with this technique where I create a clay head of some of the main characters. And so I'm going to share them with you right now. We've got a few here. So the main character is John Gwin, and I hope you can see. So I make a
Wow.
head that I can, that I can draw from any angle, and also control the light source. So,
Wow, that's amazing.
and then we have John Hewson, who is the tavern owner. So there he is. And then we have Quack, who was the one who prematurely set the uprising in motion. There he is. And then we can't forget the ruling class. We can't leave those people out. So we have the Governor Clark. So
Wow.
the man in ruffles. So so as you can see, the light changes on the face, the shadows, depending on where it's coming from in terms of the light source of the scene. So that gives a bit of an idea of what, how one, you asked about the research of it. How do you know what to draw? Well, there is the detective work, but there's also, in terms of simply drawing over and over again these characters, and it really is helpful to have another source to work with. And so I hope that answers it.
David, can I give away one of the secrets of our graphic novels?
Yeah.
Okay, John Gwin, it turns out, is a leader in the previous graphic novel about pirates. And you'll notice that in Revolution by Fire, he talks about the example of how they organize the pirate ship.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, you can read his life, rebel without a pause, as they say. He's captured. He's almost hanged. He wasn't hanged because he was so-called property, but he escapes, and here he is in New York, ready to go again. So that's actually another one of our themes.
Mm-hmm.
The experience of rebellion circulates among people.
Well, yeah, it comes up, doesn't it? Because John Gwin is I guess he's about 30 years older or 20 years older in this book.
Yeah. So
we had to compensate for that. But also what comes across in the book as well is again, the thread of rebellion. Right. Yeah, we can go back to pirates, but there was also parts in the book where there was an older person who had been involved in previous rebellions, and the newer people wanted to find out how did that go. And Marcus could probably speak to that. It was what the character Harriet in the story.
So this is about the continuities of resistance again.
Mm-hmm.
I know Tiana has a question, but I just need to say one thing. David, so did you make those heads, like you hand molded those heads?
Yes.
So just for people watching at home, he hand molded the heads. He is a graphic novelist. He's a punk rock guitarist. He's in a band. So David, I'm just asking on behalf of all of our viewers, is there anything that you can't do? Because that was incredible. It was incredible. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Tiana because Tiana, I know you've got one.
Yeah, so my question is still about research, but more so, how did you research the languages for the different people? Because you have Spanish, you have Patois, you have like an indigenous language, some West African, what else? Gaelic and other English languages. How do you research the different languages to make them, appropriate for the characters?
Excellent question. I'd say, first of all, that the treatment of language in all of these graphic novels is complicated. It's very complicated because what we want is to convey social realism in a lot of different ways. At times, it's through all the things David's described, the clothing, the shoes, the pipes, the setting, what it looks like inside a tavern where people dance, where they fiddle, but it's also how they speak. But you can't make that so complex that people can't understand it. So here are some of the sources that we used. In the patois, these are languages that grew up in many different multi-ethnic situations. Especially among people from different backgrounds in Africa. So we used several models for this, one of which is a dominant language in Sierra Leone, which is called Creole, which is very much like, in some ways, the 18th century languages that we were after. So we pulled a few examples from there. Another major source for us is a quite wonderful book called A Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue. And this is from 1785, a man named Francis Gross. And it's full of all of the lingo, or the cant, as they called it, of the underworld, of thieves, of robbers, of just working class people, really. And so in every book we've done, or at least the last two, we have some phrases from that book about how people actually talk. and we put a glossary in there so that if you read something that you can't understand, you go to the glossary and you see what it meant. So, this the challenge of language was great because this was a multi-ethnic meeting house. And of course, we have a few words of Gaelic in there for the Irish. So we really had to do our homework to make this believable in a real sense without making it too complex and therefore unreadable. David, would you like to say anything more about language?
Well, it is a concern with each of these books, whether it was about Benjamin Lay or the Pirates or Revolution by Fire. It's always a discussion that we have between us as to how far we go in being authentic to the time period, because again, to be too authentic would probably make it somewhat incomprehensible to a reader, and that's not exactly what we want to do. So it's a combination of trying to give a feeling of authenticity in terms of the cadence of how language is, without it being into the realm of incomprehensible. So it is a discussion with each of these books, including the next book that we're doing. We've had to make decisions about this in terms of that. So, but it's definitely an issue.
For example, Quakers had their own way of speaking. They had a very thee and thou and all this. Sailors have their own way of speaking. They have their own language and work language. So to us, this is part of the authenticity, as David said, but this is also part of the history from below, so that you can imagine these as real people. Great question, Tiana.
Following up with language, we talked about how this is a multi-ethnic uprising, and it's one of the things I think that makes it really interesting and really special. And you talked about the leaders who were men, and that each leader would work to gain the trust and the involvement of people who were from, like, historically the same place that he was from, like the same sort of group of people. Can you go into more detail about that?
Yes. Now, it is true that many of the rebels were men, but two women play very important roles. There's Peg Carey, who is very important to this story. She's kind of the visionary in our story. She's the one who helps people to imagine what the new world will look like. So that's a very important role. And then there is Harriet, an older African woman who is a veteran of an earlier uprising of enslaved people in New York, and someone who has all of the lessons to impart to the younger people, the newer generation. But it is also true of this reality in New York that there was a kind of ethnic organization of gangs, right? There was kind of an Irish gang and a Cuban gang and an African-American gang. They weren't gangs in the modern sense, but they were people who had cultural commonalities. So the question became, how do you organize cooperation among these groups? And it happened at several levels, but perhaps most importantly, among the leadership. The leadership, they worked together, they knew each other from the docks, they developed a level of trust. And so you can see in the book, John Gwin goes to the Irish, and then he goes to the Cubans. He said, we need you. We need you. We need your weapons. Do you trust us? And eventually they come together. So the creation of trust is really the key to the whole thing. And David and I are both very interested in labor history, how working relations they don't always, but they can breed that kind of trust and solidarity.
Thank you.
I think that's a really important part of what I think I take from, a lot of these stories, is that you've provided agency to people who are typically not seen as individuals who have any control over their lives at all. And the fact that this is terrifying to the people in charge. And, for those of you who, are familiar with how these things end. I find it very interesting how the pictures of men hanging and women hanging is actually seen by the people in the story as hopeful. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we see hope in that. In that, usually it's like, well, why did they bother if they just died? Like, what's the point? But there's hope there, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What's hopeful about that?
David, you've got some great things to say about the hanging scene.
No, you go ahead. I'd love to hear what you're going to say about this, actually. So
okay, so look, the struggle is continuous, and sometimes you lose, and everybody who is there in New York knows that happens. In fact, some of them have already lost and ended up in New York because they were sold away from a place where there was another failed uprising. We have several people like that, and that is actually factually correct within the record of the time. So one of the things that we always do, we've done this now in the last 2 graphic novels, is that we depict the relationship between the people who are being hanged and the people who are watching the hanging. And if you notice, there are always soldiers at the gallows to prevent a rescue. Now, we know in actual fact there were successful rescues of pirates by sympathetic mobs in the earlier 18th century. So why do people come to these hangings? Many of them come because they know that it's one last chance to see somebody curse the authorities, to say to the men in ruffles, excuse me, fuck you, we don't give in. And that there's another phase of the struggle coming. That's what John Gwin says on the gallows, right? I'll be with you in spirit. So anyway, if you take the long view, as John Hewson's daughter does, learning about this event of 1741, 50 years later in 1791, you are continuing the circulation of the stories of rebellion. You are contributing to the next one by telling the inspiring stories of the previous ones, even if they failed. Because what you salute is their courage. They fought. Okay, they lost, but we learned something and we'll move on. So this idea that there is as my friend, the late Julius Scott put it, there is a common wind on which the subversive knowledge circulates. And so that idea is built into our depiction of 1741. How'd I do, David?
That was extremely eloquent, and I love hearing you talk about it because it is so profoundly interesting. And we try to end the book on with what you said, in a sense of optimism to the future. So our last panel is someone thinking, where is this going to go? What is the next rebellion? And so we kind of leave it hanging like that. So no, that was great. I wanted to make one point before we run out of time is what we're doing with a graphic novel. It doesn't take the place of a long prose book of great research, which Marcus has made so many books like that. But the fact that he wants to work and make graphic novels and make history more accessible and available is just so fantastic. And he's also done things like written songs, and he's written a play on Benjamin Lay, and he's made films, and he has, I think, a children's book coming out on about Benjamin Lay, I think, too. And so the idea of taking history beyond the classroom, beyond a rarefied world of people who want to read a long prose book, is just so great to be engaging in all the art forms. And so I really admire his stamina to do this, and I think it's essential. And I think there's a kind of a change where more historians are seeing the value of going outside, just outside of the book that they make, the great book that they make, and seeing the other purposes it can be in terms of communicating ideas and history. And again, I go back to the idea that it's essential for a healthy democracy that we have as many options for people to engage at all levels and all ages.
That gave me chills. I'm sorry. It was good. It was really good. But like I said, I'm a student of revolution, so I think this is just such a great. And I think you're right. And I think that, like I said earlier, before we started, in teaching, you need to find ways to bring people into the story. And sometimes you have great people, and then you can create more, and then you can guide people to sources and material culture and things like that. So I think it's just because they are people who lived and breathed and loved and hated and passion, and this is a way to fill those people in and kind of bring them to life in a different way. And I think it's great. So I'm done, Kyla.
Well, I wanted to follow on what you were both saying. And I mean, I really appreciate the talk about democracy and what is critical to democracy and these multiple forms of engagement. And one of the questions that, and I think we're all getting the time, but what does this Afro-Irish uprising mean for contemporary readers? Like, here it is. This book just came out like on the 12th, right? It's brand new, November 2024. What does it mean? What are some takeaways or points of inspiration or thoughtfulness for readers to have now?
Okay, David, your turn to go first.
Well, I mean, I'll just be I can never be as eloquent as Marcus can. So
That's not true.
It is. So I can only say, that the idea of people in a time where we live, where it feels like it's a drift towards authoritarianism around the world, that the idea of presenting stories where people at the lower echelon of society actually rise up and try to resist, and it is actually a compelling story. And the history of tyranny, which is hundreds of years old and continues, and exploitation continues. We need these stories to move forward and to inspire citizens and activists and those who want to be activists, or we don't know where these books will engage with people, like Audrey just talked about. But it's I mean, that's what I want to come out of this book and out of the work that we've been doing with this series of books is there's a lot to be learned from history in terms of where we have come from and where we are and where we're going. And this to me is essential to living a free life and envisioning a better future for everybody. And so in an overall way, that's how I relate to the book. And Marcus may well have more specific points that we might, inspirations that we might get out of this book.
Well, David and I are both very proud of the fact that our two previous graphic novels, and soon this one, have been translated by young activists in Thailand into Thai in the pro-democracy movement. And they are using the Thai editions of these books to reach other young people to build a movement. We also just learned that Benjamin Lay graphic novel just won an award for one of the best graphic novels of the year in South Korea. So this is very affirming to us. But look, for our times, we're going to be facing some dark hours ahead. David and I think that these kinds of books can be inspiring to people. One thing that I find to be paralyzing, which causes people to think that they can't do anything, they can't act, is that they frequently feel like they're alone. And if you learn that the kinds of things you're fighting for, freedom, for example, from tyrants, like the enslavers of New York in 1741, and the tyrants who are getting ready to take control of the U.S. government. It's good to know that people have been waging that battle. And so you see the example of courage you see what people did, that can really make a difference. So one thing a book like this can ask people in the present is, who's ready to fight?
Yeah. It is a wonderful book. It is a wonderful book. And so I do want to say we are unfortunately out of time. I'm sorry, I'm a little under the weather and I feel like I might start coughing, in which case Audrey's going to jump in. So sorry. For those of you who are watching and tuning in, if you have not had a chance to read this book yet, I hope you are getting the sense of how, first of all, it's absolutely beautiful. Like, it's a beautiful book. It's so rich. It's so evocative. But as I think you've also just heard, it's really important. And it tells a part of history. And we're talking about history, history from below, this social history about people like you and I, and what they have experienced and what they have done. And it is encouraging and it is hopeful. And we actually have a quote here from Denise, who's ready to fight, Marcus Rediker. So, there's a lot to really think about and take away from this book. And so we encourage you to buy it. It's one of the best ways you can support our guests, of course, is by buying their book from your favorite independent bookstore. And you can also take it out from your local library. We love libraries. And of course, our partner is Prince George's County Memorial Library System. Thank you so much for partnering with us tonight. Thank you for everybody who's watching, whether you're watching live or you're going to tune in on demand later. The fact that you've chosen to spend your time with us, we really value. You are why we do what we do. Please check out our friends, the library, at pgcmls.info. They have an events page. They have 125 wonderful events every single day. And you can also check out our website at civilrights.mypgc.us to see what the Office of Human Rights is up to. Marcus and David, it was absolutely wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. We love this book. And I'll just say this right now, we would love to have you back. So please, for the new graphic novel, the children's book, like we would welcome an opportunity to talk to you again. But we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.